When I was little, my twin sister and I used to sleep in the same bedroom. My bed was by the door, and her bed was against the far corner. There were two windows in the room. One was on the back wall over the head of my sister's bed. The other was over her mattress on the other wall. I always used to be jealous that she had two windows over her bed, while I had none. The one facing the front of our house opened into an overgrowth of rose bushes, so we rarely used it. But the one by her headboard opened over the driveway at the side of the house, and we used to open it and play games where we'd tie toys to strings and lower them down into the garden to be played with later on when we were outside. The house was on a hill, so there was a pretty significant drop out that window. My sister and I were particular about our routines as children, and when we went to our room for the night, we always asked for a bedtime story. We had strict specifications for these stories. They had to be made up by our parents, not just read out of a book. And we wanted a new one every night, no repeating stories. Our mom and dad took turns with this so that they could have some time to come up with new material. One night, my sister was in an unpleasant mood and gave our mom a little bit of trouble getting ready for bed. To soothe her, our mom promised that my sister would be a character in that night's story. And in fact, the story would be all about her. Normally, I would feel left out by that sort of thing, but in this case, I don't remember it bothering me. So, our mom told us a short but lovely story that night about an enchanted horse that could speak and fly. It would come up to the window at the head of the bed while we were sleeping, she told us, and take my sister on its back to fly and have adventures in magical lands. We both loved the story and fell asleep soundly, and nothing unusual seemed to happen that night. Both of us slept well without waking until the morning. It was a small room, so if either parent came in or there was a disturbance, we would usually wake up. But the next morning, we discovered something strange. Several strands of what was unmistakably horse hair was stuck in the window frame. It was like a horse had jumped out of the window and gotten a few hairs on its tail caught. There was no way that the hairs could have been placed there without opening the window, and it had been closed all night. It was an old sticky window that you had to struggle with to open, and when you finally did get it open, it made a loud racket when moved up and down, so we definitely would have woken up if it had been tampered with overnight. Even still, we assumed at first that our mom had played a joke on us. But when we asked her about it, she was as confused as we were. She's also not really the type to play pranks and is a very bad liar. We never did figure out where the horsehair came from, and both my sister and I found the whole thing very creepy. It never happened again, and I don't know what to think about it. But it does make me wonder if maybe there's more to childhood stories and imaginations than we realize. Maybe there's a kind of magic there that we don't understand, or a connection to something real that is unable or unwilling to connect with adults or the adult world in a meaningful way. A friend and I were walking under some beech trees early morning. This was in England, Hampshire, when we both noticed an amorphous grayish shape on the ground about 100 meters ahead. It appeared to be a deer. It shuffled under one of the large lower branches of a beech tree. It then morphed into the branch, and then emerged again. When it emerged, it had become two female figures, each about 3.5 to 4 feet tall. They both had long flowing dresses on and wings on their backs. One had long blonde hair and the other had long black hair, and they both had a pair of insect-like wings and were pretty. They appeared as classic fairies as depicted in books. They appeared strongly connected to nature and natural forces. They were making the branch rock and sway, and they were also laughing. I could hear and feel the laughter, which was very hypnotic and beautiful. It reminded me of a babbling brook. I felt their laughter in my whole being. And like I said, it was like a babbling brook or rustling leaves or tinkling bells. I pointed and asked my friend if he could see this, and as soon as he looked in their direction, they dissolved. I saw nothing further. They were fairies, that's all I know. As to what fairies are, I have no idea whatsoever. I'd been walking in a local woodland for the third time in 3 days and was using the name Oberon as a mantra, similar to a Buddhist monk might do. I'd been walking for some time and felt quite tired, so I decided to pause for a rest, propping myself up against an oak tree, an old one. I nodded off very quickly for a matter of less than a minute. At the moment my eyes opened again, a roe deer appeared in front of me, looked at me, and then ran off into the wood. I followed it with my eyes. When they settled back on the view immediately in front of me, there were three little beings standing there, staring at me. They seemed very curious about me. The one on the left was holding what appeared to be a pad of paper and a paintbrush of some kind, and was seemingly painting the face of the one on the right. Her face, the one who was painting, was in profile, and she then turned and faced me. She had big green leaves where her forehead was, and a small pointed face with a small nose. Her face was white, and she had what looked like eyeliner around her eyes. They were small and dark. She stared at me and put her face close to mine, and the suggestion was, "Would you like yours done?" It was like she was asking if I wanted my portrait painted. A telepathic thing, I suppose. I was so stunned. I didn't say anything. I hardly even moved. Then they seemed to get bored with me, and they burrowed under some leaves and logs and were gone. This was Sunday, 15th of May, 2017. Okay, so I came home an hour or two later, and I'd been racking my brain as to what the form and color of these beings I had seen were, trying to commit them to memory like you would a recent dream. I thought I had seen something similar decades ago in literature. I found the image online, and it was a Brian Froud image. The beings I had seen were very similar in likeness to his work. Thinking back to the experience, there was a wonderful clarity to it, but I have to admit it wasn't an unusual experience in my life. I've been involved in psychic questing for many years and have had unusual experiences in stone circles and at home, and have shared them with others who have experienced similar things. What has interested me is that often when one person sees something and one or two people stand right next to them, then they see it too. So I think sometimes you have to be standing in a particular spot or looking from a particular angle to see these beings. I think fairies, ghosts, aliens, etc. are all the same experience. Just the labeling is what defines them differently. I was walking home one night when a rustle began in a hedgerow to my right. I thought I saw an animal in there, a badger or a fox, probably out hunting, and didn't think much of it. That thought soon fled when the rustling followed my every step. This was not usual behavior for an animal. I increased my pace, and so did my unseen friend. I started to get really worried when, on encountering a gateway in the hedgerow, the rustling transferred to the other side of the road. By now, I was petrified, but pig-headed enough to not show it. My unseen companion followed me for another half-mile. Then came the part I will never forget. The hedgerow rose above the road to about my shoulder height. It became sparse, thin, more barbed wire than foliage. I turned my head sideways, and there, blotting out the stars, was a shadowy figure, about 3 feet tall. I only saw the figure in silhouette, so I couldn't make out much about it. I could tell it was short and stocky and human-like. I could not make out its attire, but it was bulky at the waist, wide at the shoulders. It made no sound. I heard no music or vocal utterings. If it was looking at me, I could not tell. But it stood for a moment, as I did, before I ran the last mile home. If it followed me, I couldn't tell, for the blood was thrumming in my ears. When I reached my house, I collapsed in the door. My older brother was up, and he saw my state. He still says to this day that my hair was standing on end. Did the place where I was walking have a reputation for this kind of thing? Well, this happened in Ireland, and in Ireland it's hard to find a place that's not aligned with some ghost, spirit, or otherworldly being. I think the thing I encountered was a fairy. Me and my brother have seen what we believe to be ghosts, and this wasn't one. Lately, I've been researching ancient Irish history, going back to the myths and legends. We have a myth that Ireland was inhabited by a race called the Tuatha De Danann, people of the goddess Danu. When the Fomorians invaded, it's said that the Tuatha De Danann fled underground. Now, a myth is a myth, yes, but I think each myth carries a kernel of truth. And maybe this one points to some underground civilization for which we are unaware. My boyfriend and I were taking a walk, or rather hike, through the woods on these trails in a nature preserve that's local to where I live. As we entered the nature preserve, I told my boyfriend I was hoping we would see some deer. I should mention that deer are my absolute favorite animal, and I love them tremendously. In the past, I have had the opportunity to feed several wild deer out of my hands, and it was an incredible experience. We had only been in the nature preserve for a few minutes when my boyfriend shushes me and points to the left of the trail. There were 2 deer standing there, still as can be, staring right at us. I was so excited. 2 minutes into the preserve and we were already seeing deer. I felt incredibly fortunate. As we moved further into the preserve, walking the winding trails, we began to spot even more deer. We saw 3 standing up on the hill, several does meandering over a ridge, and then yet more deer grazing between the trees. The more deer we saw, the more both I and my boyfriend began to notice something kind of odd. The deer were all staring dead at me. They weren't looking at or even acknowledging my boyfriend at all. We even tested it with my boyfriend walking ahead of me up the trail and trying to draw their attention. But no, they just kept staring directly at me. I started getting a weird feeling as I watched several more deer that were watching me. It was like they were statues, dead, cold, and still. They weren't flicking their tails or shifting or even breathing as far as I could tell. They were just staring. And I was overcome by this ominous, otherworldly feeling, a strong conviction that these deer weren't actually deer, but something else. I can't really explain it better than that. It was just a weird, ominous feeling. I had this feeling for the rest of the time we were out there, a feeling that I was being watched. Now, this is the type of nature preserve where people bring their kids and their dogs. It's a wonderful, calming place with a peaceful atmosphere and really nice scenery. So there was really no reason for me to be unnerved. And yet there was something about those particular deer and the way they looked at me as if they were sizing me up. I'm a highly sensitive person, so I wonder if that's why they focused their attention on me and not my boyfriend. It was like I knew that they weren't really deer, and they knew that I knew, and they were watching me and waiting to see what I would do if I would call them out. I can't explain it more than that. I was pretty freaked out, and we left soon after. But I have wondered since then what might have happened if I had said out loud what I was thinking at the time. Those are not deer. Those are fairies. This story is from my grandmother. I'll say first that my grandmother had a lifelong aversion to lying, an extremely strong moral code. In her 60s, she claimed that she had never once in her life told a lie to anyone. And I believe her. This happened when my grandmother was a little girl. At the time, she and the family lived on an isolated tract of land in 1930s Wyoming. The life she lived was extremely rural. In a way, though not technically, she grew up in pre-industrial America. That is to say, things like radio, telephones, and phonographs were exotic to her. So one afternoon, as a child, my grandmother was playing with her brother in some rolling, grass-covered hills, not far from some scrub brush and sparse woods. At some point, her brother wandered off by himself, leaving her alone, playing in the grass. As she was sitting there, she saw a little man dressed in overalls run across the grass and bolt under a rock. Completely surprised by this, she jumped up and chased after the little man, following the trail he had run to the rock. She looked all around the rock, but didn't find anything unusual. The rock was large, but small enough for a child to turn over, and so she heaved the rock up, and when she did, out jumped a rabbit. But the rabbit was wearing overalls. The little creature ran off faster than she could follow, though it ran away on 2 legs, like a little person, until she couldn't see it anymore. It may or may not have been wearing a hat or holding something in its paw. She wasn't sure about that. But she was sure it was running on two legs and wearing overalls. A rabbit. These are all definite and certain details of the story. Asked repeatedly, she swore it happened exactly as she described, but had no hypothesis, beliefs about, or explanations for the event. She was always patient with all of the obvious questions, i.e., was it a prank? Had her brother put some overalls on a rabbit and trapped it under a rock, etc.? But she always came away from the questioning certain that it was exactly as she said, and simple as it sounded. Neither her brother nor her other family members ever indicated that they had played a prank on her, and in fact, denied anything of the kind. It's highly doubtful a stranger would have played such a prank. They were highly rural people, and just people in general being around would have been unlikely and rare, and certainly not for playing such an elaborate and strange prank. My grandmother was a Christian woman who went to church, but she had respect for Native American beliefs and considered them a complement to her own. Her husband, my grandfather, was a quarter-blood Cherokee. She just had no idea what it was. The story reminds me a bit of Alice in Wonderland, but I believe my grandmother that this happened to her for real. It makes me wonder what would have happened if my grandmother had, like Alice, followed the rabbit. Would I even exist? Maybe even a story as strange as Alice in Wonderland has a little bit of truth in it. That this world is stranger than we think. And there are other worlds, just a blink, a moment, a tumble down the rabbit hole away. Thanks for watching, and thanks to everyone who submitted their stories. Let me know what you thought of these stories. Have you ever encountered what could have been a fairy animal? Do you have any theories about fairy animals or about the fairy world, if it exists, and what it might be like? Let me know in the comments, and I'll be there joining the discussion today, answering questions and reacting to comments and suggestions for future content. If you have a story to share, don't forget to send it to me, and you can do so by checking out my website at scaryfairygodmother.com. There's a spot there where you can submit your stories, comments, questions, and suggestions, and also join my mailing list. It's free to sign up. If you do submit your story or have submitted it in the past and I haven't narrated it yet, that doesn't mean I won't. It just often takes me a while to get to all of the stories. So eventually you will probably hear your story on this channel. I'm really trying to get to them all. So thank you so much for taking the time to share it with everyone. As always, special thanks to all my supporters on Patreon who are helping to keep this content going and hopefully expand in the future. I just really appreciate you guys so much. It means so much to me that you're supporting this work. If you like this content and would like to support it, you can check out my Patreon page. The link is in the description. The stories in this video came courtesy of subscribers and the Fairy Census at the Fairy Investigation Society, so thanks to everyone who submitted. The stories were edited for dramatic and narration reasons. If you would like to read the original Census stories, the link to the Census is in the description. Please leave a comment below, like, share, and subscribe if you're new. It really helps the channel when you do that. It tells the algorithm that people are interested in this video so that more people can enjoy it. So thank you very much for doing that. Hit the bell to receive notifications of new videos as well. And until next time, this has been a visit from your scary fairy godmother.